So everyone loves to talk about just how similar Gilead is to America today. Now, there are similarities for sure, but I think what's also very interesting is when you look at the core values, the ethos, how it's diametrically opposed to not just America, but Canada, Europe. When people talk about Western culture, there's this sense of individuality in the sense that individual choices, free expression, there's a high premium placed on that. And when you look at the state, people think of it as primarily existing to serve the individual. And what can the state do for individuals within it? How can the state protect individuals, give things to individuals, lift up individuals? And with fascism, that principle is completely inverted. In Gilead, one of the best depictions of fascism maybe ever. And you just see how in fascism, defining characteristic is individuals exist primarily for the health of the state and for the health of the nation. When you look at what should our policy be, what should we allow individuals to do, it's whatever's best for the state. And individuals, rather than finding their happiness through themselves and their own actions, individuals find their meaning and their identity through the state. So we see this most monstrously in Gilead, where individuals' bodily autonomy is restricted and severely, severely violated for the good, supposedly, of solving the fertility crisis. But we see this in so many other ways as well. When you look at what people wear, the outfits, not only are they very drab and you get the sense of humility and modesty, and not only are they uniforms. Now, anytime you have uniforms, it's promoting the sense of group cohesion and hierarchy. You look at the military, organized sports.
Organized sports are so fascist, it makes me sick.
But not only are they uniforms, but they're uniforms that are specifically tied to their class, and not just their class, but their role within the society. So when you look at someone where the clothes they wear, and also their name, not only when you have names like Offred, not only is that dehumanizing, but it's also completely fusing and tying your identity, what you wear, what your name is, to your role and to your function within the state. And what's also interesting is how in Western society, I don't know if you can even call it Western, but in non-fascist society, there's a sense of multifaceted identities and people being well-rounded and having hobbies, having other interests. There's no sense of extra things being bad. It's things are just anything extra you can add is good. But in Gilead, you see this reverse where there's this kind of minimalism, and anything extra, any kind of extra learning, any kind of extra hobbies, free time, childhood, anything that's not essential is viewed as inherently suspicious. And again, you see this very monstrously in Eden, and you see these how young they're marrying girls, and you see this sense of childhood and this kind of aimless, free play, directionless time of adolescence, teenage years, finding yourself. They see this as not a good thing, but a bad thing, something very suspicious, that really when you're not doing something that's necessary for the good of the state, when you're reading books just because, nothing good can come out of that. And when you look at the fashion, what people wear, you start to get a sense of fascist aesthetics. And you look at even the people who have the most power in society, for them, style and how they look and present themselves, it's not about having your own unique style and building a unique wardrobe and sticking out from other people. No, it's about how well you can polish your shoes and clean your suit and be very presentable and also blend in well with everyone else in the society, especially when everyone gathers for these ceremonies and you get these big spectacles. Now, the visuals at these ceremonies in particular are so striking, and you see how you get these incredibly striking visuals, not from a bunch of different colors and a bunch of different outfits and all these different diversity being creatively put together. No, you see a few colors, a few outfits, and you see how symmetry and order and choreography can create these, again, Handmaid's Tale, very stunning, visually stunning show, when really there's not much there they have to work with, but through these minimal elements, through this kind of rigid hierarchy and choreography, they can create, and these spectacles and everyone coming together for these ceremonies. And what's interesting about these ceremonies is, for a fascist society, there's always this looking to the past, and this kind of respect for tradition is such a huge part of it. And what's interesting is fascism, usually it arises out of a time of struggle and turmoil. It's hard to imagine a society where incomes are rising, everything's going well. It's hard to see a fascist movement really taking hold. It's usually during times of crisis, and we see the false flag and the terrorism attack that was orchestrated by the people doing the coup. So we see this kind of seizing power in a time of emergency, but also there's this other element of seizing power in a time of emergency, but also a time of decline. When you have a society that has never really been developed, has never achieved material wealth, you don't really see fascism taking root usually. You see different ideologies taking root. Fascism really seems to take root in a time where there was great wealth, there was this great flowering of culture, and then there's this perceived decline. And fascism, it's again this fusion, it's this desire to be revolutionary, but also this desire to recapture some kind of perceived golden age in the past. And this kind of traditionalism, this fusing of the old with the new, you see this in the architecture and the home decor. In some ways you see the buildings and the homes and they look very sleek and futuristic, but also you see just the couches and the light fixtures, and they're old, and they're trying to recapture this old style, and it's just this interesting fusion. You also see it with the kind of fusion of hyper logic and twisted rationality, and then also unthinking obedience to tradition, to religious texts that have been passed down. So when you look at the fertility crisis, on the one hand, there was this kind of hyper rational response, and they would say, look, we've got to repress individual rights to solve the crisis, because if we don't solve the crisis, then everyone will die and we'll have no individuals to begin with. So there's kind of twisted hyper rationality, but then there's also justifying it with the Bible and kind of, look, we can't logically argue with anything that comes down to the Bible. It's above logic. It's been passed down. So again, it's this kind of fusion of illogical blind obedience to authority, and then also in some ways this kind of just twisted hyper rationality with no adherence to morals whatsoever. And you see this permeate all levels of society when Fred tells Serena what the highest value in Gilead is, and he says even higher than protecting children, it's obedience to the husband. You see how this kind of blind obedience to the husband matches the blind obedience to military commander, the blind obedience of that military commander to the Führer, whoever's heading up the society, and the blind obedience of the Führer to God, or whatever religion the fascist society happens to have. So this kind of chain of blind obedience and hierarchy permeates the whole culture. And then last thing, I did want to go back to the home decor. Oftentimes we see books in the study, and we see these big imposing tomes, and it's interesting when you look at these books, they don't seem inviting, and it doesn't seem like these books are ever read, ever intended to be read. It seems like these books are more intended to be guarded and hoarded and respected, and you start to get this sense of, again, knowledge in a fascist society. In a current society, knowledge is always seen as good, whether it's the media informing the population, whether it's people going to university and learning. There's no sense that knowledge can really be bad. There's this belief that good ideas will win out, and really we need to have this open marketplace of ideas. And again, in fascism, there isn't the same sense that learning and knowledge is always good. And it goes back to this idea of you have a single function, a single role to the state, and anything extra you do that's not conducive to that role or doesn't help you facilitate that role is in some ways somewhat suspicious. So if your role is to be a wife, a handmaid, anything extra you do that's outside of that role is very questionable and suspicious, and again, just so different than our society where we value, and so we so value being well-rounded and having these kind of diverse identities. Oh, I'm an American, but I'm from Ecuador, and I have that important part of my heritage. I make videos where I do acoustic rap covers, and you get these people with these very diverse and multifaceted identities. In Gilead, you see these people where it's like, oh, I'm a handmaid for Gilead. I'm a driver for Gilead. And you never really get a sense, even the people that are in power, you never really get a sense of them having these different aspects to their identity. You see them really only in terms of their role and their function to the state. And I guess militarism, and especially military expansionism and going to war with other countries, that's often associated with fascism. We don't see that in Gilead as of yet. They've kind of kept their terror and oppression within their own borders. They haven't really tried to inflict it on the rest of the world. But other than that, I'd say Handmaid's Tale really just nails fascism at its core, and the look and the feel of fascism in its most extreme monstrous form. And I think with everything that's going on with, you know, the rise of kind of an online culture with a lot of fascist memes, a lot of fascist, you know, jokes, maybe not jokes, a lot of people openly identifying as fascists, whether they're trolling or not is questionable. I think it's interesting that we have such a mainstream show that just gets fascism so right.